We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Zayin Amud Beis and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 107b. And the previous summit, the Gemara brought a three-way machlokas tanoim. Let's say you have three judges, and they're evaluating what the property of orphans is worth. And one of the judges says it's worth 80 zuz, and other of the judges says it's worth 100 zuz, and the third judge says it's worth 120 zuz. So the first opinion was that we say that it's worth 100 zuz. We essentially pick the middle amount. And now the Gemara is dealing with the opinion of Rabbi Elazar Rebbe Tzadok. Rabbi Elazar Rebbe Tzadok says that we say it's worth 90 zuz, and the Gemara now explains the reason why we say 90 is because this piece of land, Tishin Shava, actually is worth 90. V'haid Kamar Esrim, and the person who said 20 sela again, is 80 zuz. The person who said 80 zuz, to Kotoi Asar La'achori, because he made a mistake and he said 10 less than it really is. V'haid Kamar Mon, and the person who said 100 zuz, Kotoi Asar La'kamei, he made a mistake and he said it was worth 10 more than it actually is. And that's why we assume that it's 90, and we also assume that the person who said 120 was simply way off. But the Gemara says, Adrab, on the contrary, why do we say that? We could say the opposite. Hayara Meyo Va'asara Shavya. We could say, for example, that the land is actually worth 110. V'hayda Kamar Mana, the person who said 100 Katay Asara La'achore, he's saying it's worth 10 less than it actually is. V'hayda Kamar Shloshim, and the person who says 30 Sela, which is the same as 120 Zuz, Katay Asara La'kameh, he's saying 10, he's making a mistake and saying 10 more than it actually is. So why do we say that it's worth 90? Why not, with the same logic, say that it's worth 110? And the Gemara says, Nekot mios trei kamoy biyadach. It's better to take the first two evaluations, the mitoras money lo mafkile, because then you're not taking it out from a money. You're keeping the amount less than 100 zuz. We don't want to start saying it's more than 100 zuz if we can keep it less than 100 zuz in line with the first two judges. And the Gemara continues, Acheirim omrim, again, this is the third opinion of the Braisa. Others say, Osin shuma beinehen, we evaluate between the largest and smallest amount. What that means is, the smallest evaluation was 80, the largest was 120, and the difference between 80 and 120 is 40. Umishalshin, and then what we do is we divide that by 3 and we add it to the lowest amount, as the Gemara will now explain. Kasavri, the others hold as follows. Hi ara tishin utlosa v'til sashavi. The land actually is worth 93 and a third. That's 93 and a third is adding 13 and a third, which is when you divide 40 by 3, that's 13 and a third. So you add the 13 and a third to 80, which is the lowest evaluation, and you get 93 and a third. So they hold, again, that the land is actually worth 93 and a third. And Haid Kamar Esrim, the person who said that it's worth 20 sela, which again, 20 slaim, is actually 80. So Katay Tleisar Vitil Salachori, so he's making a mistake by 13 and a third. He's going 13 and a third lower than it actually is. So we add that and we say again that it's 93 and a third. V'haid Kamar Mona, and the person who said that it was worth 100. Katay Tleisar Vitil Salakamei. So we understand that to mean that he's making a mistake of also 13 and a third. Uvedinhu delay matzvei, and really he really wanted to say more than 100, meaning to say, really he wanted to say a little more than 100. He wanted to say 13 and a third more than the land is actually worth. But the reason why he didn't go so high is Savar, he thought to himself, I don't want to make it. He was afraid to make it too high, too much kuli high chavra. He didn't want to go too much higher than what the other person said. The other person said 80, and he's going to go and he's going to say 106 and 2/3, which would actually be 13 and 1/3 more than the actual value. But he said it's sufficient that I just go up to 100. I don't want to go that much more than what my colleague said. But the Gemara continues, Adrab, again, on the contrary, you can say the opposite. You can do this exact calculation in the other direction. You could say, Ha'ara meya utleisar utlasa shavi. You could say that the land is actually worth 113 and a third. And Haidakam Armon, and the person who said 100, Katay tleisar utlasa lachore, he's a little lower by 13 and a third. He's saying a number a little bit too low. V'haidakam Arshloshim, and again, applying the same logic, the person who said 30 slime, which is actually 120, so Toy tleisar utlasa he's making a mistake also of 13 and a third. And the Gemara continues, and really again he could have said more. He didn't have to say 120. He could have said, in this case, if he would have made a mistake of 13 and a third, it would be an amount of 126 and 2/3. But the reason why he said 120 and not 126 and 2/3, because Savar, again, he thinks to himself, stoi to come atfina kuli hayachavra. It's enough that I went so much higher than my colleague. I don't want to go higher than 120. And so again, the question is, why are we assuming that the number is the lower amount? By the same logic, we could say that it's this higher amount. And the Gemara again says the same answer as before. Nekot mios trei kamai biyadach. It's better to take the evaluation of the first two judges. Again, the mitoras meya lo mafkile. That way, you're not taking it out from 100. You're not making an evaluation of more than 100 zuz. We want to keep the evaluation less than 100 zuz. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rav Huna says, Halacha ke'acherim, the halacha is like the others, again, that the land is actually 93 1/3. Amar Rav Ashi says on that, Taima da'acherim lo yadin, we don't even really understand the reasoning of the acherim. Hilchasa avdinan kevasayu, and we're going to say the halacha is like them. They have, again, the most complicated kind of evaluation is the acherim, and so that's why Rav Ashi is saying it doesn't make sense to say that the halacha is like the acherim. And the Gemara continues along the same lines, Tanu dayone golo osin shuma beineinu meshalshin. It was taught that the judges of the exile, they also do like the acherim. They make an evaluation between the highest and the lowest, and they divide by 3, and they add that to the lowest. And again, Amar Rav Huna says, Hilchasa kedayane gola, the halacha is like these judges of the exile. And again, Amar Rav Ashi says, Taima de dayane gola lo yadin, and we don't even understand the reasoning of the dayane gola. And Hilchasa avdinan kavasaya, we're going to follow the halacha like them. It would not make sense to say that the halacha follows an opinion that is so difficult to understand. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Ha'omer l'chaveru, one who says to his friend, Chatzi sada ani mocher lach, I'm going to sell you half of this field. Half of my field I will sell to you, but he doesn't identify which half of the field. So the Mishnah says, Meshamnin beinehen v'notel chatzi sadeu. They do some kind of evaluation between them, and he takes half of the field. And the Gemara will explain exactly what this means. And the Mishnah continues, Chatzia bedoram ani mocher lach. Now let's say he says, I'm selling you the southern half of the field, and so therefore he's identifying which half of the field he's selling to the buyer. The Mishnah says, Meshamnin beinehen, they do some kind of evaluation between them. Again, the Gemara will explain this. V'notel chatzi bedoram, and he takes the southern half of the field. And the Mishnah continues, V'hu mekabel olav. Now the seller accepts upon himself to give the buyer a little extra land. He doesn't just give half of the property, he gives a little extra land for makom hageder, for a place for the fence, because the fence will be outside that property, so to speak. And charetz uben charetz, and also to dig a ditch, and a smaller kind of a ditch. V'kamahu charetz. Now how much is a large ditch, or a regular ditch? Shisha tvachim, that's 6 tvachim. Uben charetz shlosha, and ben charetz, which is a smaller kind of a ditch, that's 3 tvachim. And the Gemara will explain why these ditches are given over to the buyer. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says, Lokeach notel kochosh shabo. The lokeach, the buyer, he always takes the inferior property. You have a property over here, and now the seller is giving half of the property to the buyer. The buyer is going to take the inferior half of the property. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Chia bar Abba says to Rabbi Yochanan, V'hanon mishamnin beineyan tanan. How can you say that the buyer takes the inferior property? But it says in the Mishnah, mishamnin beineyam. They do some kind of evaluation between them. That sounds like they're dividing the property 50-50. That's the question that Rabbi Chia bar Abba asked Rabbi Yochanan. So Amar lei. So Rabbi Yochanan said back to Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Adachalt kafnaisa bebavel. While you were eating dates in Bavel, tergimna miseifa, we explained the Mishnah using the end of the Mishnah. We were able to explain it properly. The Katani seifa, because what does it say at the end of the Mishnah? It says at the end of the Mishnah, Chetzia bedoram ani mocher lach. It says if he says to the buyer, I'm selling you the southern half of the field, Meshamnin beineyan v'notel chetzia bedoram. It says we do this kind of evaluation, and he takes the southern half of the field. Now, how do we understand this? Why are they doing an evaluation? He told him he's giving him the southern half. What do we need to do any evaluation for at all? We shouldn't do an evaluation. He should just give him the southern half of the property. So, rather than the reason must be that we're trying to figure out how much the property is worth, because he's supposed to be taking property that's valued at 50% of the entire property. Meaning, if he takes the southern half, and let's say the southern half is inferior, then what he's going to be taking might only be worth, let's say, 40% of what the whole property is worth, and he's entitled to a property that's worth 50%. So the reason why we have to evaluate the property is we want to make sure to give him the southern half, and if, let's say, we need to give him a little more property than 50%, or a little less property than 50% in terms of quantity, but we might need to give that in order that he gets it to be evaluated at 50%. So let's say, for example, the southern half is an inferior property to the northern half. He actually will not get 50% of the property. He'll get a little more than 50% of the property, so that southern half is going to be worth the same amount as the northern half that the seller is keeping. And so hachanami lidmei. So the same thing is true over here. When we're saying over here that the buyer takes the inferior part of the property, he does take what is inferior, but still whatever he takes has to be worth 50%. 50%. So we figure out what the entire property is worth, and we give him the inferior plot of land. Now, it might be more than 50% of the land because it's inferior, but it's going to add up to 50% in terms of monetary value. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Mekabel of Mokom Geder V'chulu. Again, it said in the Mishnah that the seller accepts upon himself to give the buyer a place for the fence and a place for the charetz and the ben charetz. And the Gemara says, Tana was taught, charetz mi bachutz, the charetz, the larger ditch, that is further out than the ben charetz, uben charetz mi bifnim, and the ben charetz, that's closer to the fence. Now, they're both beyond the fence. V'zeh achorei geder. Both of them are actually behind the fence, but first you have the ben charetz, and then a little further out, you have the charetz, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Ches Amud Aleph.